The caddis hatch sometimes gets overlooked in all our excitement over mayflies and stoneflies, especially early in the season. But caddis hatches stay consistent throughout the summer, and they only become a more and more important food item as the season goes on. Plus, the first big caddis hatch of the year can be an absolute blast if you hit it right. This week on Untangled, we'll take a detailed look at the caddis. When these bugs start getting active, their life cycle and behavior, and the flies we recommend for a successful day on the water. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Excited to sit and chat with y'all today about caddis flies. And our focus today is going to be mostly on the Mother's Day caddis hatch or the granum caddis, and we'll get into all of that in a second. But a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about with caddis flies today applies to the caddis all season long. Because that's one of the great things about caddis flies is once they start hatching, once they start moving around and showing up, they're a consistent part of a fish's diet all the way until like October in a lot of places. Usually, at least out in the West, that first big freeze of the year usually shuts the caddis activity off. But from now until then, they're a big part of the fish's diet. So the more we know about them, the more we learn about them, the more successful we're going to be on the water. And while the focus, again, is going to be mostly on this big, early first caddis hatch, a lot of this is going to apply to caddis throughout the rest of the season. So again, caddis hatch generally all season long, but this first big hatch that we get right when they come in with a bang, caddis show up and they're like, you ain't going to forget about me. But then we do sometimes because the mayflies are on and some of the stoneflies might be coming out. And then the caddis sometimes get lost by the wayside for whatever reason. But this first big hatch that you run into out west, we call it the Mother's Day caddis hatch. That's the famous name for it on a lot of the big rivers out here. But that same species of caddis, it's just the granum caddis is the name of it. It hatches out east too. I'm not exactly sure why there's this distinction between calling it the Mother's Day caddis here and granums out east, if it really is, that different in timing, because out here in the West, usually the first couple of weeks before Mother's Day and the first couple of weeks after Mother's Day is when you start to see this hatch really come off. But you get the granums hatching out east the same time. So if you hear about the granums, the Mother's Day caddis, we're talking about the same fly. So for your east and west coast folks, we're talking about the same bug. And what I really want to dig into is a little bit of the behavior of the fish during this particular caddis hatch, because they do present some unique problems that you've got to solve. But then we'll also dive into how the caddis act as well, because bug behavior's very important part of figuring out this fly fishing thing. So we'll get into both of those. And then again, just remember what we talk about as far as bug behavior, that is going to carry through to all the other caddis hatches for the rest of the year. So let's start out with bug behavior. It's always funny to sit here and talk about behavior. I feel like I'm back teaching high school again, where bring a parent in and yeah, we need to discuss Billy's behavior. Yes, he's fluttering too much in class. Whatever it is, it's always fun to sit down and talk about it. But let's go through the caddis life cycle real quick and paint that picture. Make sure we're all on the same page. So your caddis flies, they start out as an egg, just like all our aquatic insects do, and then they hatch into a larva, and they'll stay in that larval stage for about a year. And a lot of times these caddis will form a case that they'll live inside, these little rocky cases, just little bundles of rock to keep them protected from predators. And they'll, shoot out of the case to eat and then come back into it a little bit. Some of them might spin webs and catch other little critters to eat in their webs. And others might be free swimming as well. But a lot of them are going to form that caddis case. And then once they're ready to hatch into full adults, that's when they leave their case and they transform into the pupal stage. And this is the emerging form of the caddis. This is when their wings are starting to form, their bodies are starting to develop a bit more like an adult, they're starting to grow armpit hair. They need to wear deodorant. They're asking questions about, well, does my hair look better this way or does it look better that way? And what's Sally going to think? This is that stage of life that they're going through. And then they're going to move up through the water column and hatch into that adult dry fly. And then once they're an adult dry fly, they fly away. They leave the river to mate. And what's really interesting about caddis flies is they can stay away from the water for like a month before they come back to mate. So sometimes you'll go to the river and you will see a bunch of bugs leaving the river and going to the bushes, or you'll walk, especially through the willows. You'll walk through the willows and you'll just bump mountains of caddis out of the willows. And you think, oh, I got into it. The caddis are hatching. And then you get to the river, you put a caddis or a gone, and the fish ignore it because maybe they're not actively hatching right now, even though you saw them all in the bushes, because they'll stay there for like a month sometimes before they migrate back to the river to lay their eggs and die. And that's the final life cycle stage of the caddis, just like all of them. And then the fish really, really do love the dead, spent caddis or the egg-laying caddis as well. It presents some pretty unique opportunities for the fish to eat these flies with a very small chance of those flies escaping them. So it's one of the big draws to eating them. And if all this is just a little bit too much to remember, because I know I'm throwing a lot at you guys, and if you're new or whatnot, you're like, Durant, slow down, I can't write my notes fast enough. Well, we've got our handy dandy little VFC field guide. Move it so there's not a glare on it. This is a completely waterproof book. It's sized to fit in your fishing pack. And if you're watching the video podcast, I've got a clip of it up here. But this thing's literally got all the flies, all the rigs you need to know to fish with confidence. So you can find all your info in here about bug trends. Let me flip to the caddis page. So everything I just talked about with that caddis life cycle is in here. We've got rig diagrams in here. It's a fantastic little resource. And we're giving these away for free. We just want you to have them so you can have a better day on the water. All you have to do is pay for shipping to get it to your house, but these little field guides, completely free. And there's a link to grab those in the show notes, or there's one right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast as well. But a lot of that info is going to be in here. It's a very helpful little resource to have. Now, we talked a little bit about the bug behavior, how they act, what they're doing, their life cycle. How do the fish react to that? Because that's really going to be the key. We got to know how the fish are acting so that we can properly imitate the bugs in the right way. So during the Mother's Day caddis hatch and many of the Granum hatches, you're going to see these huge swarms of bugs hatching all at once. And that's what sets the Mother's Day hatch apart, is it has this reputation for just all the bugs hatch at once, and there are carpets and carpets of bugs where there's just thousands of them on the surface. And I've been in one once in Montana where it was, I couldn't believe how many bugs were on the water. And this is coming from someone who has been lucky enough to fish the green during its blue-winged olive hatch. And that's supposed to be one of the ones where, yeah, there's bugs everywhere, right? Same thing, where you just can't believe the sheer number of caddis that come off during this Mother's Day emergence. And it's really interesting because sometimes you'll get to the river, there will be that many bugs on the water. Not a single fish is rising to them. Carpets of caddis piled deep. Your grandma would put this in her house and it would match the shag carpet in her house, right? That's how thick and luscious this mat of caddis gets on the water, and the fish aren't up eating them. And it makes your brain just short circuit and stop for a second because you see that. You think, what? How? There are so many bugs on the water. How are the fish not coming up and eating them? Okay. Well, the reason for that is as many adults are on the water, there's also that many caddis pupa right underneath the surface. And trout really prefer to eat the caddis pupa for whatever reason, especially during the Mother's Day hatch. They really enjoy the caddis pupa over the adults, especially when you get this big emergence of all the bugs all at once. And a lot of this is because the caddis pupa, they're helpless. They can't do anything. They are just shooting up through the water column and hoping that they can emerge from their nymphal shuck, dry their wings out, and escape before a fish eats them. They really don't have any kind of defense mechanism at this point. The trout know this. They're smart. We talk about trout having brain size of a strawberry or whatnot, and there's probably a lot to be said for the fact that, we like to ascribe more intelligence to these creatures so that when we don't catch them, we don't feel as bad about ourselves. But I still hold that they're some of the smartest creatures on the planet because they realize this. They realize the caddis people really can't escape. They realize that, that's an easier meal to eat than the adult with its wings out on the water. Okay. So that's why you can definitely run into that situation where there's so many big adults on the water and not a fish eating them off the top because they're just chowing down on the pupa because it's easier, it's helpless, and they can eat just as much, if not more, than on the surface. And they don't expose themselves to overhead predators or crazed anglers with wing sauce dripping from our beard. They're just they're a lot safer when they're eating underwater. So, like I mentioned earlier, caddis are going to go through all of these phases, regardless of the species that hatches. But when the granums hatch, when these Mother's Day hatches come off, again, they're coming off in such giant numbers that the fish really get stuffed on the pupa. They just eat and eat and eat so many of these pupa that a lot of the times, they're eating pupa and they're ignoring the adults. But then I think you do get to a point where they've had too many flies. I've heard that from some guides I know who guide the Mother's Day hatch every year where the fish are literally just stuffed. They have caddis coming out their gills. They've eaten so many that they can't fit any more in. So they just kind of quit eating because they've just gorged themselves. This is less of a problem with other caddis hatches. You won't see the same enormous emergence all at once. You won't see the complete ignorance or complete ignoring of the adults. You'll see it to a degree, but not to this degree that you do with this Mother's Day hatch, this first big emergence of the year. Now, once the caddis start skittering away, once they've dried their wings off, they're ready to get off the water, they're drying their wings out, they're ready to get away and mate. The fish might get hungry. They might look up on them at that point. So skating or skittering a caddisfly at the end of a pool, it's a great way to tease up some fish that maybe have room for another bite. This is like their Thanksgiving meal. It really is, where they can just go to town and no one judges them because everyone's doing the same thing. So that's one way to try and get them to eat off the surface. But then the other part of this that becomes a big dry fly opportunity for you is when they come back to lay their eggs. Okay? And that could be, a while after this big emergence. They'll stay in the bushes sometimes for up to a month, like I mentioned. But when they do come back to lay their eggs, they've got all this extra protein on them. They've got their eggs on them, and they're really vulnerable. And they'll dap the water to lay the eggs, and you can actually see the eggs will be kind of bright green on these caddis. And that's when the fish are going to pounce because they see that bright green. They know that means extra protein. So they jump up and they really go after the adults when they're laying the eggs. So if the fish stuff themselves on pupa earlier in the day, they're ignoring the adults. If you stick around and wait, if some come back to lay their eggs that night, which is not a guarantee, but some might, okay? If you stick around for that, or, you let the big emergence go by and then a week later you go and you start fishing some egg-laying caddis patterns, chances are you can probably do pretty well for that. Now, the caddis are going to move in huge swarms to lay their eggs as well. So after that initial emergence of all these big bugs on the water, if you go back and fish a week or two later and you see big swarms of caddis moving upriver, they're not heading to the bank, they're heading towards the river. Follow that swarm and fish it as it moves up the river because the fish are going to key in on that as well because that's where all the egg layers are going to be. Now, let's dig into a little bit of the rigs and tactics for fishing. Let's talk a lot about the theory, about what you should look for. Let's talk about the rigs and tactics for a minute. I like to start out most of my caddis hatches fishing a dry dropper rig. I got an adult on top and then I throw a pupa as my dropper. And if the fish are ignoring the dries and they're crushing the pupa and I'm catching almost all of them on that, then I might just switch to a 2-nymph rig with a soft hackle up top and a more traditional nymph on the bottom. That way I can kind of swing the rig a little bit. I can give it some action. That soft hackle will trigger some eats. and then I'll cover both stages of that pupa as it's emerging, right? It's an effective way to do it. The other way that you can fish it as well is a double dry fly rig if you are seeing them eating emergers. Now, fish do get a little bit excited about these caddis, and they tend to chase the emergers a little bit more so than mayfly emergers or midge emergers. I'm not quite sure why that is. I would have to say it's got something to do with it's just a bigger bug generally. So there's more there. And I think there's more of a gas bubble trapped around them. I think there's just something in the way the caddis moves that really triggers the fish to chase those emergers. So we talk about a lot of the times looking at rise forms to tell if they're eating the adult or the emerger. Okay, when they come up to eat the bugs off the surface, do you see their nose break the surface? Do you hear a splash? Do you see bubbles? Do you see rings? If that's happening, they're eating the adults. If you don't really see the fish at all, you just see some rings, you just see their tail fin or their dorsal fin break the surface, they're eating stuff right below the surface film, usually the emergers at that point is what that's telling us. With the caddis, it can be a little different. If there's some big splashy rises, if they're really making a ruckus, it could be small fish just making noise on the adults on the surface, or it could be some of the bigger fish chasing those emergers as well. But a double dry fly rig is going to work great. If you suspect that they are eating the emergers and you want to try that, you can throw your adult caddis out there with the emerging caddis behind it on 15 to 18 inches of tippet, and you can give that a shot. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way at all. If they're eating the egg layers, or if they're eating the completely spent caddis at that point, I'll just fish a single dry, if that's what they're nosing up on. And then one other thing we can talk about here as well is the caddis, for an aquatic insect, they really don't spend a lot of time on the water, because once they shoot up, they're on top of the water, they dry their wings, and then they leave. And then they come back. They don't really sit on the water the same way mayflies do. They dap the water to lay their eggs, and then they bounce away. So they'll skitter and they'll skate and they'll move and they'll bounce a lot more than your other aquatic insects. So if you can bounce or skitter or kind of move your caddis a little bit sometimes, it can be an exceptionally deadly way to fish these bugs, because that's a really lifelike imitation of them instead of just throwing it out there and getting a dead drift, which I know is going to be kind of counterintuitive because we talk about how important a dead drift is all the time. And yeah, make sure there's no drag. But with the caddis, that's how they're acting. So sometimes if you're not getting the fish to come up and eat, try adding a little bit of action, a little bit of bounce or flash to your caddis and see if that'll trigger them, because that is how a lot of those adults act, where they don't spend a lot of time on the water surface. And when they are on the water surface, they're actively trying to get off of it. Whereas mayflies, you'll watch them. They'll just sit there with their little sailboat wings poking up like, oh, I'm just happy to be here. It's the lazy river float today. And then gulp, fish eats them. So that's just one other little tool you can have in your toolbox. Now let's wrap up this portion of the show. Talk about the fly patterns we recommend for your caddis fishing. So for caddis larvae, I would recommend having a peeping caddis. It's a great option. It looks like one looking out of its little case. And then honestly, hare's ears, Frenchies, pheasant tails, they can pull some work during this hatch too. They've got the right size and shape profile for a lot of caddis larvae. And then mop flies also work really well this time of year. They've got that the same sort of shape and action that caddis pupa do. I remember talking to a buddy of mine. He theorized that's why mop flies are actually so effective, is because of how they mimic the caddis pupa. I don't know if that's entirely true, because the mop fly, it doesn't look exactly like a caddis pupa. It just has some of the same movement and shape to it. I think the mop fly just works because it looks buggy. But it would be a good one to have on during this hatch. I've caught some very nice fish on mop flies when caddis are out and about. So I would definitely have one in the box. For the emerging caddis, I would go ahead and make sure that I'm fishing the CDA caddis. I really like that. You can fish that deep, or you can fish it closer to the surface. The half-bait caddis as well is another great option. And then the old softy, it's one of our soft tackles here that we've got. Green bodied soft tackle, looks like a lot of the caddis that are coming. If you want to really target the emergers, if you want to swing wet flies, that is a great option to have in your box for those emerging caddis. And then for the adults, the time-tested, just classic, good old elk hair caddis, really tough to beat how awesome that fly is. But then the puff caddis, I really like that one as well. If the fish are being a little bit pickier than usual on the adults, if they're, they really want something that looks a little bit more realistic than the elk hair caddis, the puff caddis is a great way to go. And then if you're in a caddis hatch where they're a little bit darker bodied or you're fishing a little bit rougher water, then the foam caddis is another great option. It just floats a little bit higher with that foam body. And then the puff caddis also is great to use when the bugs are eating the dead caddis as well. At the end of the hatch. And all of these flies that I just listed, I'll make sure I throw a list of those in the show notes for you guys too. But we also have all of those available as 3-packs, which you can go ahead and pick up for yourself as well. The link to do that's in the show notes. Or you can go to vfc.media/flies and pick up the 3-packs there. And then there should be a QR code on the screen as well. Just get you ready, get you out on the water. You don't have to worry about tying them. We've got those for you. But to wrap things up, hopefully it was straightforward. Hopefully we got some good information there for you. Most caddis hatches really are pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand. Once water temps hit about 50 degrees in your rivers and your lakes, that's when the bugs are going to predictably start coming off. And they'll do that for the rest of the season, like we said, till about October. They do start moving earlier in the day than mayflies. They get out of bed earlier. They're a little bit more of a go-getter. Mayflies kind of lazy like me. So you really can find caddis out and about, sometimes just after dawn. And unless you're in one of these big Mother's Day hatches like we talked about where the river's just covered in adults and no fish are rising, the chances are the trout aren't going to stuff themselves completely silly on the pupa. They are still going to want them. That's still a very good fly to fish. But that's the example of just how picky the caddis or the fish can get during the caddis hatch. Sometimes they really do just want that pupa. It's rare to see it where they only eat that and ignore all the adults, but that's something to keep in the back of your mind as you go through and fish this hatch. That might be something you end up running into. So with that, we're going to wrap this portion of the show up. If you got any more questions about caddis flies, if you got any feedback or comments about this portion of the show as well, definitely drop those questions. Let me know. I'd love to help you guys out with that if we can. But it is now time for the Q&A portion of this week's episode. And every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, there's a link to send those in down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Hunter from Montana has our first question, writes in and says, what do you do with the extra tippet on your nymph rigs at the end of the day? It feels wasteful to cut it off and toss it, but it also creates a mess if you try to shove flies and tippet into your box. Sometimes those nymph rigs can have a substantial amount of tippet between top and bottom fly, especially after a still water day. It's a good question, Hunter. Thanks. Personally, I just throw the line in the river and hope the manatees choke on it. No, I'm kidding. And for the YouTube algorithm, I'm definitely kidding. I love manatees. They're amazing. I actually saw my first manatee in the wild on our Florida trip in March. Yeah, March is when we went on that. Those were so cool. I was not prepared for how enormous they are either. I knew they were big, right? I watched the specials as a kid, but holy cow. Anyways, no, I've actually made a concerted effort to not drop the tippet and actually shove it somewhere so I can throw it away later. I think that's a good thing to remind us of because it's easy to just snip it and forget it, especially when you're re-rigging in a hurry. So definitely make sure you're putting it somewhere that you can chuck it later. But I honestly just toss the line. I know it feels like a waste to do that, but I'll just throw it away when I get to the gas station after a day on the river. I'll just chuck it. But the reason I do that is I think about the state my tippet's in after a day of fishing. If you're like me, You've probably snagged a tree or two. You've probably caught a rockfish or 8. Your tippet's probably been through the ringer in a couple of ways. You've probably scraped it. There's probably some abrasions on it. You've probably yanked on it a few times. Hopefully fish have tried your knots out a little bit. It's probably just not in great shape at the end of a long day of fishing. And if you reuse that tippet, if you just like cut it off and store it somewhere, or if you cut the rigs off, and just stuff them in your truck somewhere, which I have done all too often. And then a month later, I'll get stabbed by this random hook, and that's terrible and not fun. Then what you are running into is that tippet. Again, it's been used already. It's who knows what shape it's in. You run the risk of snapping that off on the fish at some point because it's not fresh and clean a new tippet. So that's got the thought process behind why I just don't save my rigs. I just don't. The exception to that is if I'm fishing still water and I'm there multiple days, I will leave my rig just rigged up overnight, and then I'll just keep fishing that because I'm usually tweaking my rig throughout the day. I'm tying new flies on, and there's usually less branches and rocks and junk to get caught on in still water at that point. So my tippet hasn't been through the ringer at that point. But after you've caught 5 or 6 fish, and if they're all good fish, I do kind of worry, how's my knots holding up? How's this holding up? Because I lost a really, 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 really big cutthroat at Pyramid Lake because one of my knots pulled loose because I'd hooked and lost like 5 other fish that day. And then I hadn't checked my knots. And yeah, so it was not good. And that's not to, that also doesn't even bring in the fact that, if you tangle your rig at any point during the day and then you untangle it instead of just cutting and retying, that tangled line's got some kinks in it. It's not going to be as strong either. So there's a lot that goes into why I don't just reuse the rigs. But if you are on still water, you leave your rod rigged up overnight, you're camping somewhere. Little pro tip, don't leave your rod out next to the trees. Put them up somewhere because the chipmunks, the squirrels will eat the cork. And the last thing you want to do is wake up in the morning and have a cork grip that's been chewed on by something that maybe has rabies. So, and again, personal experience on that one as well. So that's why I just don't save it. We call this stuff terminal tackle for a reason. It's stuff that's going to get used. It's going to get thrown away. And this is part of why I don't spend money on the really expensive leaders and tippets. I just don't. I did for a good chunk of time in my early on in fishing, but even when I was a guide, I would buy in bulk from Scientific Anglers, and it was just their base level stuff. I didn't buy the really expensive stuff. I get all my leaders, all my tippet for a season of guiding. I'd buy it before the season start, buy it in bulk, and go through it. And I'll be honest, I haven't noticed the difference between how that stuff performs, how the high end stuff performs. The VFC tippet and leaders we've got, I mean, it's all the same stuff, really, at the end of the day. I know, who was it? Umpqua just came out, I think, with some new tippet. I haven't really looked into that to see what the difference is between it, but it's supposed to be really great, and they're selling it for like $25 a liter or something ridiculous like that. It's all the same at the end of the day. Don't worry. Don't buy the soup, like the Walmart stuff. I don't know that I would necessarily trust just because it's Walmart, but buy the stuff from us, buy the stuff from wherever else. You're going to be fine. You don't need to spend tons of money on it. It's terminal tackle. You're going to go through it. That's just part of the game. Now, I have seen some products lately that they have pushed out where you can like spool your rig up on it and you can save your rig and it's wound up on these little spools. It's a good idea. I'm not knocking the idea. Personally, it seems like more trouble than it's worth for me. I probably wouldn't do that. I will just retie it when I get to the river. But that is something to look at if you really don't want to just throw the rigs away. Then take a look at those products. It might help you out. So, good question. Appreciate you sending it in. Thanks. Drake from Alberta has our next question, writes in and says, what is barometric pressure? And is this another thing we need to add to the list of things we need to consider when going fishing? Absolutely, Drake. Honestly, you need to get a master's degree in meteorology. You need a PhD in entomology. and you need a triple PhD in fly casting and a quadruple knighthood in snobbiness to really just complete your fly fishing education. No. Let's dive into this, because this is a question we've been asked a lot lately. So let's just ground zero. Let's get into it, and then I'll let you know my answer, okay? The fancy definition of barometric pressure is the weight of the air pressing down on the Earth's surface. That's what barometric pressure is. But anglers are interested in barometric pressure because there are a lot of anglers who will tell you that it absolutely, unequivocally, without doubt, has an impact on how good the fishing is on any given day. And they will say that fishing on a falling barometer, so before a storm's rolling in, there's less pressure because the storm's coming in and moving the pressure out. Fishing on a falling barometer is often considered to be the best. And I'll be completely honest, I've had some amazing days on the water right before a storm rolls in. Had some incredible times. And I've also had incredible times on the water during the first part of a storm as well. But I have never once looked at the barometric pressure to see if it's rising or falling before I have gone fishing. Never once have I done it. Now, the offshore guys, the guys who fish a lot of salt water, even the inshore guys who, they're not chasing marlin or tuna, but they're doing bonefish or permit or whatever, or redfish. And then a lot of the still water anglers, they will pay attention to this. And in the saltwater, there's enough people I know and trust who say that really does matter, that I will give it to them. I'll say, you know what? I think it probably does for those fish. For trout, I don't think you need to worry about it. There's going to be folks who disagree with me on this, and that's completely fine. But it's just one of those other things that I look at and I think, hey, is this going to make a difference? Am I going to look at the barometer and am I going to say, oh, it's rising, I'm not going fishing today, if everything else is great? If the stoneflies are coming off, the water flows are good, the water temps are right, but the barometer is rising, and I'm going to let that tell me, no, I'm not going to fish? That's just, it doesn't really make sense in my head. And I'm not saying, Drake, that you're using it to not fish. I'm just, kind of going through the whole motions of thinking this out. But the big reason, too, that I'm not going to put any stock in it is there's lots of stories. There's anecdotal evidence. I'm sure we're going to get tons of comments about it where people will say, oh, I only fish on a falling barometer, or I only catch big fish on a falling barometer. Okay, I don't doubt you. I don't doubt you at all. But stories and anecdotal evidence aren't scientific proof. And to this date, there is no scientific study that actually says, yes, trout eat more during a falling barometer, so you should only fish for them then, or trout won't eat during a rising barometer, so don't fish then. So we can't say that it's a rule. We can't say that it's one of those things. It's hard and fast. Yes, this exists in fly fishing, because there's no study. There's no consensus on it. Because again, I just go fishing. And that's what I encourage everybody else to do. Just go fishing. We can sit here and we can think and overthink and analyze and overanalyze and worry about whether we've got a sink tip that's correctly, or whether we've got this that's set up right, or whether our hair's ear has enough dubbing sticking out of the thorax. And just go fishing, right? That's my answer to all of it. That's my answer to everything in life, honestly. It's just go fishing, because it fixes a whole lot of things. It was John Gierach who said, the answer to any problem in life, love, money, whatever, is to go fishing. And the bigger the problem, the longer the trip should be. It's a direct quote from John. And 100%, one of the truest things he ever said was that right there. And really, I go fishing when I can, and that's the best advice I can give you. Now, when storms roll in, there's one other point I wanted to make here too. Hold on. I had some notes. I'm sorry. I got kind of carried away. I do that sometimes. I get carried away. Where was this? I'm so sorry, folks. Yeah, water temps. I said the water temperature, I think, has more of an impact on fishing for trout than the barometric pressure. This is the other part of my notes I was looking for. I think that matters way more than barometric pressure. Okay, going back and digging into that. When a storm rolls in, okay, it gets dark and overcast. We know that trout like that kind of weather because they feel safer in eating off of the surface. So yes, the falling barometer might have something to do with it, but it's also dark and stormy, and they like to come out and eat in that weather because they feel safer. They're not as exposed to predators. So is it the barometer or is it the weather that's doing it? I don't know. There's no way to tell for sure, right? And then I'd also argue that if you get a really big rainstorm and it dumps a significant amount of rain, it could potentially shut a hatch off, especially early in the season. If you get some snow dropping even, it could cool the water down to the point where the mayflies stop hatching and it's just midges at that point because they're temperature sensitive. They hatch when water temperatures get to a certain level. So I would look at that and I would almost think that, is it the water temps? Is it the weather that's playing the impact? And then we talk about after storms on a rising barometer. Okay, maybe the river just got a bunch of rain dumped into it. Maybe it's a little muddy and off color. Of course, the fishing is not going to be as great right after that. But are we attributing it to the rising barometer after the storm moves out, or are we attributing it to the weather? So that's the other issue I have with trying to say for sure about this stuff. And that's also why I say just go fishing. Because again, that's my thought process is the water temps have way more to do with it than the barometric pressure. But at the end of the day, just go fishing. So I know I've said that enough. If you guys have feedback on this, which again, I'm sure we're going to get feedback on that, please let me know. I'm not telling anybody that you're wrong, and I'm not telling anybody that your experiences aren't valid. I'm just saying personally, it's not something that I'm ever really going to get hung up on unless the science and the evidence comes out that it's something we should. So hopefully that clears it up for you. Appreciate it. Justin from Virginia has our next question, writes in and says, I really enjoyed your recent podcast dissecting the relationship between cost and quality with respect to fly rods. It got me thinking, what about fly lines? There are thousands of fly lines in the market, each at various price points ranging from $20 to $30 all the way into the hundreds. Does the same logic apply, i.e. you get what you pay for? Or is the truth that most fly lines at a reasonable price get the job done and the higher end / cost fly lines are more marketing hype? Thanks for all you do educating and advocating for the greatest sport in the world. Good question, Justin. Thank you. And the short answer to it is kind of. It's not it depends this time, but it is kind of. The long answer is that, and if you don't know anything about fly line, if you're completely brand new to the fly line world, some of this might be a little tough to grasp. So let me give you a little bit of a primer. Fly lines are built with tapers. So they go from a thin portion where you attach them to your reel to a thicker portion where your leader attaches. And that taper makes up the head of the fly line. And the head's usually anywhere from the first 30 to the first 60 feet of the line. That's usually the line that we're casting. And the taper of that head, the way that the head is built, the way that it's weighted, that dictates how that fly line is going to perform. So heads that are very gradual, that don't have a very steep taper, they're best for dry flies, soft presentations. Heads with very aggressive tapers that are very heavily weighted, that's really good stuff for like your streamers, big nymph rigs, bass bugs, that sort of thing. So that's the 10,000 foot overview of fly lines. Now, we get into fly lines themselves. I think the biggest difference in fly line performance going from a cheap line to an expensive line, it's less about the line itself, less about the taper itself, and a lot more about the durability. I think that's the number one difference I see between them. Cheaper lines tend to be made with cheaper products, so they're not going to last as long. So that's just fact of life. But going along with that, you also aren't going to see a lot of different line options at the cheaper end of the spectrum as well. You usually get a weight forward line, a double taper line, a sink tip, and a full sink, and that's about all you're going to find for sale in that lower, $30 to $50-ish fly line range. Whereas if you spend a little bit of change, if you're willing to spend 60 plus, I would say, that's when you can start getting lines that are designed for a specific purpose, that have a taper that are built to do things. You can get a line that's designed to throw those big bass bugs, or one that's built for streamers, or one that's tailored for dry fly fishing, one that's, you can even get them, it's called like a hover tip, where it will sink to a certain depth and just kind of stay there and keep your midges suspended at a certain depth on still water. It's really freaking cool, but it also is going to cost a lot of money because there's some engineering and some materials that goes into that you're not going to find on those cheap fly lines. And those specialty lines, the ones that are designed for a specific purpose, they're often going to cost more money, use nicer materials. There's the time to develop them. So then you're going to pay more for that at the end of the day. Now, the question here is, do you need those fancy fly lines? Do you actually need them? Now, on our recent bass trip to Florida that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and you're also going to hear the full details of that trip in an upcoming episode, so stay tuned for that. But we had all sorts of different fly lines rigged up on 6 or 7 different rods. It was awesome. It was a gear junkie's fever dream is what that was for me. But we had all these lines put together, and they were designed to throw the different sizes of bugs that we were throwing at the bass. Okay. And those lines really did make a difference in how well I was able to cast the exceptionally large bass bugs. The line was heavy, the rod was heavy, the fly was heavy, but having the right line that was designed to do something like that made a huge difference. It was a lot easier to handle. For trout fishing, though, that's where I look at it and I say, I really do default to a do-it-all taper like this, the Scientific Angler's Infinity. That's what we recommend as an upgrade on the fly flinger and the reels we sell here at VFC. It's a really good all-purpose line that does well. I've fished dry fly hatches with it. I've fished nymphs with it. I've fished small streamers with it. I've fished, bigger nymph rigs with it, and it just works really well for me. Now, that being said, I do have some specialty dry fly lines that are on my 4-weight rods, because for me, if I'm going to take my 4-weight out for the day, that means I'm fishing single dry flies or double dry flies at the most, and I'm fishing them usually to pickier fish during some kind of a hatch. That's what I bust my 4-weight out for. So for me at that point, a line that's designed specifically for light dry fly work, that's designed to roll those over as softly as possible, that's designed to handle some of the longer, lighter leaders that we use when you're doing that kind of dry fly fishing, that makes a lot of sense to me to have a line for that. And that is the only specialty line I use on a consistent basis other than my sink tip lines for streamers. Okay, so that's another place where I could say, yes, it makes sense. But you can also get a cheap sink tip line too. You don't have to pay $150 or whatever it is for the high end stuff. You don't need that. Okay. But for your meat and potatoes fly line, the fly line that's just going to do the jobs of, dries, nymph rigs, some streamers, the all purpose stuff, you can really pick tapers like that up at any price point. I really am partial to that Infinity taper from Scientific Anglers. I think they do a great job with that, and it matches a whole bunch of different rods. It pairs very well with our fly flinger here at VFC, but I also fish it on some of my other rods when I'm just playing around or reviewing rods for other companies. And I even have a friend who designs fly rods for one of the big name companies. And I was just talking to him the other day about a new rod that he just put together. And he was telling me, yeah, I test cast almost all my rods with that Scientific Angler's Infinity taper. So it's just a really good all around line. And you can get it for like $80, I think is the cheapest that they sell it. It's in the Mastery series. So the materials aren't quite as nice. It's not as durable as the more expensive ones, but it's still plenty fine. I think like $80 is you spend that on a fly line, I think you'd be really happy. If you fish a lot and you're on the water a lot, that's when it makes sense to jump up to the more expensive ones just from the durability standpoint. But if you're just kind of the average angler, you get out 2-3 weekends a month, that $80, the Mastery Infinity from Scientific Anglers, I can't speak highly enough for that line. But again, that's really the big difference. You do get what you pay for with the specialty lines. They are amazing what some of these lines can do and how easy it makes casting them, especially the streamer lines. The ones that are designed to cast streamers, you pick them up, they're so heavy in the front portion of the line, and you can just rocket those streamers out there with almost no effort. It makes you feel like you're the best caster in the world. It's a great thing. And so they are worth it. I'm not saying that, but to each their own. You do get what you pay for. So hopefully that meandering made a little bit of sense. Hopefully they answered your question. But that's going to do it for the questions this week on the show. And like always, we're going to wrap up with the Live Real Life moment. Every week at Untangled, we end the show by sharing a Live Real Life moment from someone out there in the audience who is on the water, enjoying themselves, living real life. We love to hear about the adventures y'all are up to, see what's going on. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you would like to send to us, there's a link to do that down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Vernon, who writes in and says, "Hey, y'all, I love the show and I've learned so much from y'all. Thanks for the great show and for the very helpful instructional videos. I'm new to fly fishing and have not had a hookup yet till this past week. I've always dreamed of fly fishing out west in a mountain stream. I was in Wyoming back in May and I hiked back into a river. I felt lost and didn't know what flies to use, so I applied the stuff y'all teach and had a blast. I observed the river and what bugs I was seeing, turned over some rocks and all that good stuff. I decided to go with a hopper dropper. I put a size 18 purple zebra midge on the bottom, the very first fly I ever tied, which I just started tying some. And on my third cast, a rainbow slammed my midge and I finally netted my first fish with my fly rod. I was so pumped and got plumb shaky. I went on upstream and ended up catching a total of 12 fish, including a 15-inch cutthroat. I can honestly say I'm hooked for life." Vernon, that's awesome, man. I love it. Catching fish on flies that you tied yourself, that is one of the better feelings out there, isn't it? Awesome, man. Thank you so much for sending that story in. Appreciate it. And thanks to everybody else who's here every week, listening and watching to every episode of the show. Makes more of a difference and y'all can understand. It's so much fun that we get to do this. We love doing this. I love doing this every week. So appreciate it a ton. And if you could, please just make sure you're telling everybody you know about VFC. Spread the word. Send the smoke signals out, send it down the Pony Express, tell everybody about what we're doing here so we can help y'all live real life and enjoy yourselves. And speaking of that, until next week, folks, get out on the water, enjoy yourselves, and live real life.